Hello, friends. Patrick McFarlane here of the Liberty Weekly podcast, coming at you with another episode. This one is episode 200, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/200. I also want to remind you all that the Liberty Weekly podcast is featured on the Libertarian Institute alongside other fine podcasts. So you can check that out at libertarianinstitute.org/Patrick for my back catalog. But on the homepage, you can also find, like I said, other fine libertarian podcasts, including Year Zero with Tommy Salmons, Conflicts of Interest with Kyle Ancelone, and Don't Tread on Anyone with Keith Knight. And also Scott Horton's show is on the Libertarian Institute as well. Today we're going to be talking about Cyber 9/11. And this is something like last week's episode that I was kind of keyed into by James Corbett, just something that he's talked about for a while. And actually in this year, his prediction for the coming year was that there would be a Cyber 9/11 type event and something that would justify a digital Patriot Act. And I think that was interesting. But another reason, so I'll admit it, mea culpa, I talked about something that James brought up last week, and I'm doing it again this week. What am I, some kind of acolyte? Well, the answer is yes, in a certain way. No, just kidding. But it really popped up here in the renewed tensions over Ukraine and this kind of the specter of a cyber attack, because the West has been saying for a few weeks now, if not much, much longer, that at least there was a story from the from the UK that the Russians were planning an imminent coup and that they're planning an attack. And I was thinking that a cyber attack is a large part of this. And there's actually some things that have come up just recently in the last couple days about an imminent Russian cyber attack. And I was just thinking that this would be like the perfect false flag scenario. And I was already thinking about Cyber 9/11, and so it just kind of popped up. But I digress. And I wanted to remind everyone that I actually wrote an article called The Danger of Great Power Competition with Russia and China. And it gives a little bit of a primer on the recent tensions between Russia and Ukraine. And I wrote it over the summer, back when the tensions had heated up the last time. And really, I mean, just as some background, like ever since the United States overthrew the democratically elected government, does that sound familiar, of Ukraine in 2014 and installed a puppet government, there's been tensions with Ukraine because the eastern Donbass region of Ukraine is actually Russian supporting and identifies more with Russia, and the Crimea area of Ukraine actually elected to join Russia in what the West is always calling like a Russian coup or a Russian annexation or something of Crimea, but it was really a popularly supported movement kind of as a result, a reflection of the U.S. regime change in that area. But again, I digress. But here's my article, The Danger of Great Power Competition with Russia and China. It gives a 1,000-foot view of where we're currently at. And I know I've talked about it on this show before, probably with Dave DeCamp and Connor Freeman. I think I also discussed it with Kyle Ancelone. And I've mentioned it on other podcasts, was this return, this idea of this grand narrative, this return to great power competition. And so you can go through and kind of get an overview there. But actually, Connor Freeman dropped a really, really important article today on the Libertarian Institute, Cold War Served Hot. And so I'll throw this on the show notes page, but it gives you a really big, again, kind of updates, but it gives you the background that you need to know about to really understand what's going on right now. And I think it's very, very important that you take a look into that and that you kind of educate yourself so you know what you're talking about, and so that you can spot propaganda as it comes in. And incidentally, on Thursday night, I'm recording this on Tuesday, I'm going to be inviting Connor Freeman and Kyle Ancelone on, and we're going to dissect a Tim Pool piece saying that basically Russia is going to invade Ukraine, and we're going to get into debunking those claims because I don't think there's a lot of evidence that Russia is planning to invade Ukraine, but it's a bit more complicated than that. So Tim Pool on his show, he had a guest on, and they were saying that Russia is going to invade Ukraine and that China is going to use that as an excuse, a distraction to invade Taiwan while that happens. And so I thought I had kind of a viral tweet today on Twitter. Robbie Martin from Media Roots and Caitlin Johnstone actually retweeted it, which I thought was quite amazing. Just pretty cool for me. But talking about how Tim Pool and Luke Rudkowski are stoking this Western State Department narrative, this U.S. State Department narrative that a Russian invasion of Ukraine is imminent and that China is going to use that as cover, and that basically Russia and China want to take over the world, which, that statement could have come from Antony Blinken. So it's coming from Tim Pool and Luke Rudkowski. But I digress. We're going to get into that much more here. But our first article here is to frame the issue. And I'm actually going to throw it over to James Corbett. He wrote an op-ed 5 years ago, Bracing for Cyber 9/11. So here we have that. He says, as Al-Qaeda become the good guys again, and ISIS starts to crumble, and the latest boogeyman failed to strike a chord of panic in a boogeyman-weary public, it is safe to say that the old global war on terror paradigm is falling by the wayside. Luckily for the multi-trillion-dollar global terror industrial complex, then, that the spiffy new cyber terror paradigm is waiting in the wings to take its place. And we're seeing this all over the place. We've seen this idea of cyber 9/11 all over the place, at least for the last 12 years. But as he goes here, the idea of a new Pearl Harbor, cyber 9/11, goes all the way back to 2001. So he says, but just as the fading global war on terror paradigm requires a steady stream of perceived threats in order to justify the bloated budgets of the U.S. intelligence and security apparatus, so too does this new cyber terror paradigm require a constant flow of perceived online threats to justify the bloated budgets of the U.S. cybersecurity forces. And just as in the global war on terror, every failure of cyber intelligence and every inadvertent proliferation of cyber weaponry gives the newly created U.S. Cyber Command an excuse to expand its role and take an even bolder action on its quest to fight the net. The global war on terror and all of its attendant ills have been built on the back of that catalyzing event, our new Pearl Harbor 9/11. So naturally, the new cybersecurity establishment is waiting breathlessly for the cyber 9/11 that will justify the complete crackdown and government takeover of the internet. Unsurprisingly, the cyber 9/11 meme stretches back to almost to 9/11 itself. Back in 2003, even as the Pentagon was feverishly drafting its plans to fight the net, as if it were, quote, an enemy weapons system, Mike McConnell, the ex-director of the National Security Agency, the NSA, was fear-mongering over the possibility of a cyber attack equivalent to the attack on the World Trade Center, if a new institution were not created to oversee cybersecurity. Since then, report after report, and this is 5 years old, report after report after report after report, and we're going to look at one of those, has continued to use the horror of 9/11 as a way of fueling public hysteria over cyber terrorism. Of course, many of you reading this editorial will already know the reason for the cyber terror frenzy. There is a pre-planned solution waiting in the wings to be revealed to the public after they have been prompted to respond to the next virtual false flag provocation. We don't have to speculate on this point. In 2008, Harvard law professor Lawrence Lessig told a technology conference that a cyber equivalent of the Constitution-destroying Patriot Act is already on the shelf, ready to be rubber-stamped into law. All it requires is a cyber 9/11 to make such legislation politically viable.
Again, I'm a professor at Stanford. I've been involved a lot in the founding of Creative Commons, which Joey now chairs, and a lot around the issues of intellectual property as it relates to this space. The last 10 or 15 years, the great hope was that government would ignore what happened in the context of the internet. And in certain ways it did, in certain ways it didn't, but in certain important ways it did. And the hope was that eventually when the government kind of woke up, I think many of us kind of imagined, it was bizarre how idiotic we were, but we imagined when the government woke up, they'd actually be intelligent or rational in thinking about how to deal with this new medium. And I think the great fear I have right now is that for reasons articulated brilliantly in a book by John Zittrain called The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It, we're about 1 or 2 years before the government really wakes up to dealing with what it thinks of as the internet, and there's extraordinary ignorance inside the government about how to do it in a way that continues to foster the very best of what the internet has done. And so, the great work of people like Vint Cerf or people inside of entities that are trying to educate the government about how to do it right, still in my view hasn't penetrated. And instead it's this old style special interest corruption that is going to guide the way the government goes, and that's going to really screw a whole extraordinary amount of wealth that could be created if we kept true to what the principles of the internet were. The thing that really worries me though is again, the intersection with the government around issues about security. So, the 30-second version of the Zittrain story is there's going to be an I-9/11 event, which doesn't mean an Al-Qaeda event. What it means is an event where the instability or the insecurity of the internet becomes manifest, some major malicious event, which then inspires the government into a response. If you remember, after 9/11, the government dropped the Patriot Act within about 20 days, and it was passed. And the Patriot Act's huge. I remember somebody asking a Justice Department official, how did they write such a large statute so quickly? And of course the answer was, it's been sitting in the drawers of the Justice Department for the last 20 years waiting for the event that would allow them to drop it. And of course the Patriot Act is filled with all sorts of insanity about changing the way civil rights are not protected or protected in the United States. So I had dinner once, and Richard Clark was at the table, and I said to him, is there an equivalent? Is there a Patriot Act, an I-Patriot Act, just sitting waiting for some substantial event for them to come in and have an excuse for radically changing the way the internet works? And he said, of course there is. And I swear this is what he said, and quote, Vint Cerf is not going to like it very much. So this is a big terror. Like they're just sitting waiting for the inevitable to happen, and then slam. It's going to be bad.
Larry, could we get an advance copy?
They haven't sent it to me yet, but when I get it, I'll send it.
Yeah, so we get that very interesting little tidbit of information there. And actually, I don't know about you, but I didn't really get the impression that Lawrence Lessig was an enemy of freedom kind of in that video. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't really know him at all. But yeah, really interesting tidbit. He says, in effect, the advisors, agents, this is Corbett again. The advisors, agents, and experts in the cybersecurity industry are waiting for a spectacular cyber terror attack to justify a crackdown on the internet. Their plans include, quote, identity management schemes like fingerprinting for internet access, which would put an end to the free internet. And we're just going to follow that link here in the article. And here's an article from Christian Science Monitor from 2005. So this is an old idea. So it talks about, fingerprint access for the internet and kind of like an internet driver's license, which is something we'll take a look at a little bit later here in the episode. So if we know the psychopaths in power need a Cyber 9/11 to spring their I-Patriot Act on the internet, the obvious questions are, would the U.S. and its cronies really do something like this? And who would be blamed? The first question is easy enough to answer. Yes and yes. They would do this. Case in point, Stuxnet was a computer worm that the U.S. and Israel jointly created to target Iran's uranium enrichment facilities at Natanz. And as we have since learned, Stuxnet was only one part of a much larger cyber attack against Iran, jointly launched by the U.S. and Israel and dubbed Nitro Zeus. Wow, these operations are just ridiculous. Although Stuxnet was intended to be the cyber equivalent of a precision-guided bomb, only capable of damaging the specific computer systems it was intended to target, it quickly escaped the computer systems at Natanz and spread across the internet. Oops. Hope that kind of cyber weaponry doesn't end up in the hands of one of our enemies. That might lead to a Cyber 9/11. And once you know it, other attempts to contain the tools in the Pentagon's cyber armory have been similarly unsuccessful. In 2016, it was revealed that the NSA had not only found security vulnerabilities in numerous software and hardware products, but in direct contradiction to its early assurances, had failed to inform the vendors of these problems so they could properly secure their product. Instead, the NSA has been hoarding these exploits so it can gain backdoor access to the computer systems of targeted governments and individuals. As cybersecurity researchers warned at the time, this practice ultimately increases the likelihood that these vulnerabilities will be discovered by criminals, hackers, and terrorists somewhere down the line. With the spread of the WannaCry ransomware of 2017, with the spread of the WannaCry ransomware of 2017 itself made possible by an exploit stolen from the NSA, these fears were realized. Boy, I sure hope this technology doesn't end up in the hands of the enemies. They might use it to inflict a cyber Pearl Harbor attack on us. And who are the enemies exactly? And this is where we really key into the events of the last couple weeks. Why, the Russians, of course. It's the Russians. It's always the Russians. Did you stub your toe on a chair this morning? The Russians rearranged your furniture while you were sleeping. Only mismatched socks left in your sock drawer? That's because the Russians were rummaging through there last night with the underpants gnomes. And if you get hacked, well, you better believe that it's the Russians. In fact, even if you don't get hacked, you can just say it was Russian hackers and millions will believe you unquestioningly. Just ask Hillary Clinton and the DNC. And so going through the entire the intelligence community, that's, you know, where the Russian election hacking narrative came from. And you don't even need a hack to do that. So this is just the first half of the Corbett article here. But I thought it was really interesting, especially in the context of what's happening, showing that, yes, in fact, the U.S. intelligence community has utilized these cyber attacks. They have been very sloppy in their handling of certain cyber weapons. And wouldn't it be crazy if something happened? Okay, and fast forwarding to this week, this came out on January 22nd, which is 2 days ago as of this recording. The next 9/11 will be a cyber attack. This is on a cybersecurity intelligence blog. The FBI has compared recent cyber attacks on U.S. government and corporate entities to the same level of threat presented by the 9/11 terrorist attack. And this is really interesting because U.S. Admiral James Stavridis, the ex-NATO Supreme Allied Commander for Europe, has echoed this perspective in a recent TV interview. He says, quote, "We're headed toward a cyber Pearl Harbor, and it is going to come at either the grid or the financial sector. We need to think about this cyber attack as a pandemic." Man, that's so loaded. That statement is so loaded. And actually, I thought it was even more interesting because Stavridis is the author of a book that I read. This is 2034, for those of you listening to the audio version only. This is his novel of the next World War. And you can see he's on the spine, co-written with Elliot Ackerman and Admiral James Stavridis. And in this book, Jim Mattis, Karl Marlantes, we talked about Karl Marlantes. Well, he's on the back right here, the Rhodes Scholar. I talked about him in my episode on Vietnam. Jim Mattis, these are all the people who gave advance praise for the book. Robert Gates, Phil Clay. And in this book, there is a sneak attack, a decoy sneak attack that the Chinese unleash upon a U.S. vessel doing a freedom of navigation patrol in the South China Sea. And it really leads to escalation and a confrontation because the U.S. feels like they need to avenge the sneak attack, and the Chinese Navy single-handedly defeats the entire U.S. Pacific force in the South China Sea. And then there's a limited nuclear exchange, and basically, I think San Diego is lost in a nuclear explosion. But the United States wins because I believe they win in the book. It's been a little bit since I've read it. Spoiler alert. But I think the U.S. wins because we have the balls to nuke. Let's see. We have the balls to nuke a major Chinese city. And I can't remember which one it is. So sorry for this aside, but killing 12 million people. So limited nuclear exchange, and the only reason why it doesn't destroy the Earth is because India threatens to attack whoever pulls the next atom bomb. And so somehow we're able to limit a nuclear exchange and it doesn't destroy the Earth. But that's, I don't know if you want to call it predictive programming. You have the former commander of NATO in Europe writing this book. And now he's saying in this quote, we're headed towards a cyber Pearl Harbor, and it's going to come into either the grid or the financial sector. We need to think about this cyber attack as a pandemic. And yeah, again, Karl Marlantes, the Rhodes Scholar, writing a blurb on the back, saying 2034 is an exciting, interesting, and informative novel about a hypothetical future war with China that is largely determined by actual decisions already made. It describes in detail how a single technological leap forward by an adversary, in this case China, I think it's hypersonic missiles, could destroy our ability to communicate, resulting in a blind, hapless military. Actually, it's some kind of a scrambling device. It also demonstrates how today's military policies will leave a future United States without adequate resources to wage a high-intensity conventional war and be forced to resort to a first-strike nuclear response and its horrific consequences. So, read between the lines, we need to spend more on the military. Anyone who is concerned about where today's military technology decisions are taking us should read this book. Jim Mattis says, war with China is the most dangerous scenario facing us in the world. Absent a strategic method to manage our differences, Jim Stavridis and Elliot Ackerman's chilling novel presents a realistic series of miscalculations leading to the worst consequences, a sobering, cautionary tale for our time. So, going back to this article, it says, there's a quote from Stavridis. Now it says, now as tensions in Ukraine grows, some security experts are saying that a cyber attack of devastating proportions is only a matter of time. The rapid transformation from office-based activity to remote work prompted by the coronavirus pandemic has demanded the adoption of robust cybersecurity protocols to mitigate the risk many organizations face from malware and ransomware. Here's another interesting little tidbit. The World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report ranks cybersecurity failure among the greatest threats facing humanity within the next decade, saying, quote, attackers could trigger a breakdown in the systems that keep societies functioning. Industry and critical infrastructure which need to be running continuously, such as nuclear power plants, banking operations, intensive care units in hospitals, and coronavirus vaccine distribution. Oh no, that would be bad if that got shut down. Would be potential targets for hackers, whether they are small groups or state actors. Concerns exist that nation-state actors will test the pressure points of critical infrastructure through hacks with the aim of sowing seeds of more chaos by disrupting the supply chains during future periods of geopolitical conflict. At such times, targeting food and energy supplies of an adversary will be a classic strategy to begin with. So, then it kind of goes through it and talks about what's happened recently. Hacking of the Colonial Pipeline, which controls 45% of fuel in the eastern United States, led to panic buying. Around the world, recent cyber attacks on critical infrastructure in Australia and Israel, the vulnerability of some of the computer-operated distribution networks upon which rely. So there's dangers. These are various scenarios that concern independent cybersecurity experts, and they have three common characteristics. Physical attacks that shut off or damage some aspect of critical services, financial attacks that spin out of control and lead to bank runs. And this was specifically mentioned as something that China or that Russia might do against Ukraine, because Ukraine is already facing inflation. So this is being highlighted as a first strike towards destabilizing that Russia might take. Disinformation is the third one, via manipulating data and information in a way that undermines trust in critical national institutions. Today, it's not hard to imagine a scenario in which a cyber attack could shut down basic services such as electricity or water supply, which can and will adversely affect millions of people. So you can see in another article on the same blog, Cybersecurity Intelligence. I just wanted to make sure. Let's see. Yep. That's the title, not just the topics they cover. Whispergate. This is the 19th of January, 2022. So just a few days ago. Russia responsible for cyber attacks on Ukraine. So this seems to be like the establishment Western narrative. Ukraine's state security agency says that it has found convincing evidence that the recent cyber attacks on Ukrainian government websites are linked to hacking groups associated with Russian intelligence services. According to the authoritative zero-day website, dozens of Ukraine government computers across different agencies were wiped using a malware known as Whispergate, which deletes or overwrites important systems files, rendering systems unable to boot up or otherwise operate. This malware works in stages and may lie dormant until triggered. It has the potential to spread and infect other connected computers, resulting in permanent data destruction. The extent to which it is spread to other computer networks operated by the Ukraine government is presently unknown. This follows a week of fruitless meetings between the U.S. and Russian diplomats in which the White House had warned that Russia perpetrate false that if Russia perpetrate false flag operations and attack its own allies in Ukraine as a pretext to invade. That's a weirdly phrased sentence, sorry. The cyber attack has been called a preparatory move in advance of possible military action. So this is what we're talking about right now. This is what the U.S. establishment press is claiming. The cyber attack affected around 70 government websites in Ukraine overnight on Friday, the 14th of January, making it the largest cyber attack on Ukraine since the widespread blackouts of 2016 affecting the electricity grid. The Ukraine Foreign Ministry website was hacked and temporarily displayed a message prior to the attack warning Ukrainians to, quote, prepare for the worst. Wow, how sophisticated. Ukraine has come under intense pressure from its neighbor with the buildup of some yada, 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 100,000 Russian troops near its borders. Again, the Russian troops are inside Russia. The U.S. and NATO have offered support to Ukraine, and while Russia has made no official statement about the attack, Ukraine's Ministry of Information says that Russian media reported the attacks before Ukraine did. So, again, there's NATO coming to the rescue, saying that it's going to sign an agreement on enhanced cyber communication with Ukraine. The U.S. government, again, saying it will provide Ukraine with whatever support it needs to recover from the attack. And then here's an interesting establishment spin. Ukraine has been repeatedly targeted since 2014 when Moscow invaded and annexed Crimea. So my understanding is that the Russian soldiers were already in Crimea as a part of a peace settlement deal. And there was not a shot fired. I don't think anyone died. And it was popularly supported by the citizens in Crimea. But anyways, they say that when Moscow invaded and annexed Crimea and started a war in the eastern Donbass region, that's just doesn't reflect reality. About 288,000 cyber attacks took place in the first 10 months of 2021, according to official figures, with 397,000 in 2020. Man, that's a lot of cyber attacks. So what is really the end game here? What are we talking about? What is the threat? I'm not an expert on this situation. In terms of foreign policy, there are many people that I would defer to, although I meddle. I know enough to be dangerous, let's say. And as I've been trying to educate myself primarily on the Ukraine situation within the last couple weeks, I paid attention to it when I wrote that article, The Danger of Great Power Competition. But if we're going to put our speculation caps on, let's say that the United States actually launches a false flag attack that would start a conflict with Russia, because there's little to no evidence that Russia is actually planning to invade Ukraine, and we're going to take a look at some of the kind of parse through the fog of war in a bit by looking at some articles from antiwar.com to really substantiate that claim. But there isn't a whole lot of evidence that Russia is planning an invasion of Ukraine. They have denied that over and over again, that they're planning an invasion of Ukraine. The Russian media itself is not really saying, and I'm citing the Duran for this claim, the Duran podcast with Alexander Mercourius, I believe his name is. But Russian media is not hyping the public for an invasion. So it really doesn't see like those preparations are taking place. And moreover, strategically, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense that Russia would want to invade Ukraine. They would have to invade all the way to Kiev. They would have to like somehow hold the city. And what would they do once they invaded to Kiev? And Ukraine is just incredibly, it's a corrupt state that's in like chaos and turmoil right now. And so actually governing it would be a chore and something that's dangerous. And the United States has said multiple times that basically that they would start an insurgency in Ukraine to fight the Russians, which is a terrible idea for us to do. But the only situation in which I would actually see Russia taking action, and this is what they said, is that if their red lines are crossed, and that being if the Ukrainians invade the Donbass region. And the Donbass region is in southeastern Ukraine, and those are the breakaway republics that did not approve of the U.S. overthrowing of the Ukrainian government in 2014. And so you can see this is the Donbass region of Ukraine on the screen there. So anyways, the situation where I'm just envisioning a situation where the United States has warned, and the UK, the United States just recently planted some intel with the UK government and had them release it, that Russia is planning a coup in Kiev and that they're going to put in place one of their puppet dictators in Kiev. And here's the article that Kyle put in his news roundup. Explainer, who is Yevhen Mireyev, named by UK as Kremlin's Ukraine pick? And this is actually an individual who has been blacklisted by the Russian government. And so this is the person that the UK, again, they were fed information by the United States. The UK is saying that the Russians have picked in a coup attempt, that they're planning this coup. But what I think is more likely to happen, and the West has said that the Russians are planning some kind of a false flag event to take place in Ukraine, something to instigate an invasion or some kind of a coup overthrow. And I guess what I'm postulating here is that I'm just envisioning a situation with this cyber attack where if the United States were to try to pull something off in Ukraine, maybe they would try a cyber attack because it would be easy for them to basically pin it on Russia and use it as an excuse to start some kind of conflagration or armed conflict or something like that. And maybe the narrative after that, you could just imagine the situation would be, oh, well, this is like 9/11. There were some actors from Russia who took these steps. Therefore, we need a driver's license for the internet or a crackdown on something like that. Now, you could envision a totally different scenario where this would take place. Something that was floated by the Washington Post is a situation in early February of 2021. This is the Washington Post article. An unknown hacker or team of hackers remotely accessed the software that manages the water supply in Oldsmar, Florida. They attempted to inject huge amounts of lye into the municipal water, which could have lethally poisoned thousands of people. That attempted hack was thwarted due to sheer luck. An engineer happened to notice the mouse cursor on his computer moving across the screen seemingly of its own accord and took action before it was too late. Disaster was narrowly averted. The attack was likely not a random attack. Oldsmar is located just outside Tampa, where the Super Bowl was being held that week. And now this seems like a very cartoonish cautionary tale. Like, I don't know if I trust this as far as I could throw my computer across the room. My computer's pretty big, that being said. But yeah, it just seems cartoonish. But I mean, conceivably, that's something that they could do, is some kind of a false flag like that. But in this situation where the world is on edge, they could use it to bring in cyber 9/11 type situation. Oh, World War III was started because of a Russian hacking attack. You could see how well that would work. Or they could just use it as an excuse to control the narrative going into any kind of conflict with Russia, that the world needs to turn against Russia because Russia started World War III with a cyber attack against the Ukraine. But either way, we could go into something like, are you ready for a driver's license for the internet? And on that same token, we see discussions throughout the years of the UN chiefs calling for a treaty to prevent cyber war. So this is an article from the Sydney Morning Herald published in 2010. UN chief calls for treaty to prevent cyber war. The world needs a treaty to prevent cyber attacks becoming an all-out war, the head of the main UN Communications and Technology Agency warned Saturday. International Telecommunications Union Secretary General Hamadoun Touré gave his warning at a World Economic Forum debate, where experts said nations must now consider when a cyber attack becomes a declaration of war. With attacks on Google from China a major talking point in Davos, Touré said that the risk of a cyber conflict between two nations grows every year. He proposed a treaty in which countries would engage not to make the first cyber strike against another nation. A cyber war would be worse than a tsunami, he said, a catastrophe. Highlighting examples such as attacks on Estonia last year, he proposed an international accord, adding the framework would look like a peace treaty before a war. Countries should guarantee to protect their citizens and their right to access to information, promise not to harbor cyber terrorists, and, quote, should commit themselves not to attack each other. John Negroponte, former director of U.S. intelligence, said intelligence agencies and the major powers should be the first to express reservations about such an accord. So Susan Collins, a U.S. Republican senator who sits on several Senate military and home affairs committees, said the prospect of a cyber attack sparking a war is now being considered in the United States. Quotes, if someone bombed the electric grid in our country and we saw the bombers coming in, it would clearly be an act of war. That looks like a typo to me. If that same country uses sophisticated computers to knock out our electricity grid, I definitely think we are getting closer to saying it is an act of war. So, interesting that if one country, or if some unidentified actors or some third party were to hack an electrical grid and do something like that, well, that is an act of war. Or do something that looks like shutting off or meddling, because this is very loose. Like, there's no defined definition of how much meddling in a certain system would be an act of aggression or an act of war. Is there a requirement for actual physical damages, or is it just that someone meddled in our security systems or something like that, or that someone messed up a bunch of Amazon orders and so therefore we can go declare war on that country? But at the same time, when one country gives sanctions on another country and starves out the populace and has a bunch of people die, well, that's not an act of war. See, there's a difference here. A cyber attack where someone messes up my Amazon order, that's an act of war. But sanctions that kill tons of people, like in Yemen or in Iraq in the 90s, that is not an act of war. Hey everyone, and welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. Your one-stop shop is libertyweekly.net/support. And once you're there, you can see all the different ways to support my content. There is a Amazon wish list there you can check out. There's also a PayPal button, paypal.me/libertyweekly for one-time donations. There's also a Patreon button and a Subscribe Star button where you can donate on a monthly basis in exchange for the bonus content that I do offer. So go check those out. There's an archive there with actually hundreds of posts going back years, and you get all access to all those things with your donation. There's also cryptocurrency addresses there with all the addresses for the cryptocurrencies that I accept. If you don't see one there you'd like to donate, just get in touch with me. And if you want access to bonus content but you don't want to pay a monthly fee, you can go over to Odyssey. libertyweekly.net/Odyssey, ODYSEE, and you can purchase my bonus content there a la carte, and you can purchase it for LBC, which is the cryptocurrency that the website runs on. The best deal for subscribing and getting my premium content, though, is to go to rockfin.com, ROKFIN. You can, for $10 a month, get access to tons of your favorite creators. And you also get access to my premium content there as well. And there's a lot of great creators there that you can check out on the screen here. But for you listening in the audio version, Last American Vagabond, Monica Perez and Brad Binkley from the Propaganda Report, Joanne Leone from Around the Empire, Kyle Anzalone as well from the Libertarian Institute, just a whole bunch of people, Whitney Webb from Unlimited Hangout. So go check that out. One monthly subscription gets you access to all of that. And if you like my writing, I do sometimes release blog posts that don't end up on the Libertarian Institute on my Substack/Substack, so you can go check that out as well and see some of my writings for my email list. And of course, the Liberty Weekly podcast appears on the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org, alongside other fine podcasts, Scott Horton, Pete Quinones, Free Man Beyond the Wall, Conflicts of Interest with Kyle Anzalone, Don't Tread on Anyone with Keith Knight, my show, and also Year Zero with Tommy Salmons. So go check out those other fine podcasts and help support the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org. Thanks, everybody, and back to the show. You can see in this article here, and even since 2010, the pump has been primed for this type of scenario, some kind of a war kicked off by a cyber attack. And I just wanted to share, this is the World Economic Forum document, their risk report for 2021. And I don't know if the global risk report for 2022 has come out yet, but if you look at this chart, you can see what they call the evolving risk landscape. And top global risk by likelihood for 2021, they put extreme weather. Is that a joke? Top global risks, by likelihood, I see. First is extreme weather, and it's been since 2017. And then for seventh, by likelihood, they have, for 2021, first is extreme weather, second, climate action failure, third, human environmental damage, fourth, infectious diseases, fifth, biodiversity loss, sixth, digital power concentration, seventh, digital inequality. And then later on, it wasn't until in 2018 they had cyber attacks as being the third most likely risk. And in 2019, that was fifth. 2014, that was fifth. All other years, it wasn't on the list of likelihood. But top global risks by impact, cyber attacks actually isn't on there. Interesting. Although they do warn about it, like was stated in one of the first articles that we looked at on the cybersecurity intelligence blog, they did mention the top danger of cyber attacks. And you can see, and here's an article from Reuters in 2018, UN chief urges global rules for cyber warfare. So you can see that this has been discussed for decades now, and it's been discussed in some detail. It says UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called on Monday for global rules to minimize the impact of electronic warfare on civilians as massive cyber attacks look likely to become the first salvos in future wars. So I don't know. I think we should be really, really careful and really on the lookout for something happening in the next few months in this Ukraine crisis is what it's kind of becoming known as. And of course, this Reuters article mentions U.S. Special Counsel Robert Mueller indicting 13 Russians and 3 Russian companies on charges of conducting a criminal and espionage conspiracy using social media to interfere in the 2016 U.S. election. So, but we're just seeing that this has been talked about at length. And I don't think it would be hard to envision a scenario where there's some kind of some kind of false flag cyber attack, or really any kind of cyber attack that takes place in these tensions over Ukraine. And even if it doesn't really go anywhere, you can see it being moved in a direction by the international community to say, oh, all of our member states now need to adopt these resolutions and cede control over regulating the internet in their country to whatever resolution that we agreed to as a global community. And then we'll usher in, this kind of internet 3.0 situation where you need a digital passport or something, even if this doesn't turn into World War III. Or it could turn into some kind of a limited exchange, some kind of a regional conflict or war, but something that's so serious and shakes a bunch of people that it ushers in some kind of need, some manufactured need for an agreement. And hopefully it's, maybe it'll be something that's minor that they'll really make a big deal out of, something like COVID, where they manufacture this narrative around it, scare the hell out of everyone. And when the danger from COVID really is statistically less than heart attacks every year or people dying in car accidents, something like that. So let's take a little look at what is actually going on in the Russian situation. And here I have an article that kind of tends to show interesting, a new UN cybercrime treaty, the way forward for supporters of an open, free, and secure internet. This is an article in the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. And this is from 2020, so it's from January 2020. It's a little old, but it goes to show that Russia knows they're being targeted by the West as being perpetrators of cybercrimes. So they're moving forward for more cybersecurity. Interesting. So last month, a Russian-led resolution on cybercrime that could pose challenges for countries that support a free and open model for the internet passed in the United Nations. So this is written by Joyce Hakma, a senior research fellow with the International Security Program at Chatham House, co-editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy, and Alison Peters, the deputy director of the National Security Program at Third Way. So of course, let's just explore this a little bit. Last month, governments gathered at the United Nations to vote on a Russian-led resolution on cybercrime that could result in irreversible consequences for how countries deal with and cooperate in cybercrime investigations. While the resolution was strongly opposed by a number of major Western powers and human rights groups, it managed to pass in a final vote on December 27, 2019. With this passage, supporters of an open, free, and secure model of the internet, championed for years by the United States, Europe, and other like-minded states, should now change their global engagement strategy on cybercrime and develop more inclusive approaches and clear narratives to bring more countries to their side. So I think it's just interesting to me because everyone is accusing Russia of being behind cybercrimes, but then Russia puts forward this resolution at the UN to help with cybersecurity issues. And all of a sudden, these are civil libertarians now. People at Chatham House and the Third Way and at the CFR are now concerned about civil rights when Russia tries to maybe address the West's concerns that they're perpetrating cyber attacks. And getting a bit more modern, just last week here, our friend Dave DeCamp, he's been on this podcast, writer at antiwar.com. He writes, White House claims Russia planning, quote, false flag as pretext to invade Ukraine. I was talking about this earlier in this episode. Russia has the subtitle, Russia has dismissed the accusations as baseless. Dave writes, the U.S. won't give up on the narrative that Russia is planning to invade Ukraine, and now the White House is claiming that the U.S. has information that indicates Moscow is planning a false flag operation in eastern Ukraine to use as a pretext for invading. Quote, we have information that indicates Russia has already pre-positioned a group of operatives to conduct a false flag operation in eastern Ukraine. The operatives are trained in urban warfare and in using explosives to carry out acts of sabotage against Russia's own proxy forces. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki told reporters on Friday. Talk about conspiracy theorizing. Russia's alleged plans were first reported by CNN. One of the co-authors of the initial report was Natasha Bertrand, a reporter who built her career on pushing the Steele dossier, a now thoroughly debunked document that made false claims about the Russian government and the Trump campaign in 2016. So before we read further, I mean, you can see the pedigree of this narrative that Russia is about to invade Ukraine. After the CNN report, the claim Russia is preparing a false flag spread through most major U.S. media outlets and was repeated by the Pentagon. Missing from the reports and comments from U.S. officials is any evidence to back up the extraordinary claim. Dmitry Peskov, a spokesman for Russian President Vladimir Putin, denied the U.S. accusation. He says so far all these statements have been unsubstantiated and not backed up by anything. Overshadowed by the U.S. accusations was a Thursday report from Yahoo News that revealed the CIA has been secretly training Ukrainian paramilitaries at an undisclosed military base in the U.S. since 2015. One former CIA official said the program has taught the Ukrainians how to, quote, kill Russians. Russia held talks with the U.S. and NATO this week on Ukraine, last week, and other security issues. Moscow wants guarantees that Ukraine won't join NATO, but the demand was flatly rejected by Western powers. And so, too, earlier I was talking about that there's no evidence of a U.S. or of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Here's an article by Ray McGovern from December 27th talking about, it's titled, What? No Russian Invasion of Ukraine? Talking about how the media made a field day about 10,000 Russian troops amassing near the Ukrainian border while those troops were withdrawn on around December 27, 2001, without much fanfare at all by the corporate media. And here's another article by our friend Dave DeCamp. White House claims Russia could attack Ukraine, quote, at any point. The U.S. is also claiming Russia could use military drills in Belarus as cover to attack Ukraine from the north. He writes, continuing the hysteria surrounding Ukraine, the White House warned on Tuesday that Russia could invade the country, quote, at any point. Quote, our view is this is an extremely dangerous situation. We're now at a stage where Russia could at any point launch an attack in Ukraine. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki told reporters. Also on Tuesday, the State Department claimed that Russia could use military drills in Belarus as cover to attack Ukraine from the north. Russia said Tuesday that it has begun deploying troops to Belarus for joint exercises that would be held in February. Quote, the reports of Russian troop movements towards Belarus, which these movements are supposedly under the auspices of regularly scheduled joint military exercises are concerning, a State Department official told reporters. By the State Department's logic, U.S. and NATO military exercises in countries that border Russia could also be seen as preparations for possible invasions. In 2021, this is Dave DeCamp writing, the NATO held massive military exercises in Estonia and Latvia, which both share a border with Russia. The U.S. and NATO presence near Russia's border and in the Black Sea is Moscow's main gripe with Western powers. If the U.S. views Russian military drills in Belarus as a threat to Ukraine, the Americans should be able to understand Russian President Vladimir Putin's view that NATO is threatening Russia. During talks last week, the U.S. and NATO rejected Russia's demands for a halt in NATO's eastward expansion, but the dialogue continues, and Secretary of State Antony Blinken will meet with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Geneva on Friday. Here's another one by Dave DeCamp. Blinken hypes threat of Russian invasion in Ukraine visit. Blinken will meet with his Russian counterpart in Geneva on Friday. This is January 19th. Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited Ukraine Wednesday and hyped up the threat of a potential Russian invasion, warning Russia could attack on, quote, very short notice. He says, we know that there are plans in place to increase that force even more on very short notice, and that gives President Putin the capacity, also on very short notice, to take further aggressive action against Ukraine, Blinken told the staff of the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. Since November, the U.S. has been warning Russia is plotting to invade Ukraine. Moscow has denied the accusation, but Biden administration officials continue to make the claim just about every day. Blinken met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials and promised more U.S. support. While Blinken was in Kiev, the State Department announced that the U.S. is giving Ukraine an additional $200 million in military aid. Blinken will be in Berlin on Thursday and is set to meet with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Geneva on Friday. Despite the harsh rhetoric, the U.S. and Russia have managed to continue a dialogue. President Biden said Wednesday that there is, quote, room to work with the Russians on Ukraine and the security guarantees President Putin is seeking. And finally here, this just came out today, Dave wrote, but I suspect that this is one of the real reasons for Russian troops being near the Ukrainian border. I think another reason for it, other than planning for an invasion, which I don't think there's much evidence to support that, but is this idea that the Ukrainians might launch an offensive in the Donbass region. And this is one of Russia's stated red lines. They've said this, that if the Ukrainians invade the Donbass region, that they would intervene. Eastern Ukraine separatists warn Kiev preparing offensive in Donbass. The U.S. is poised to blame any fighting in the region on Russia, no matter who is the real aggressor, writes Dave DeCamp. The militia of the Donetsk People's Republic, the DPR, a breakaway province in eastern Ukraine, warned Monday that Kiev was preparing an offensive in the Donbass region. Quote, Ukraine not only continues its attempts to destabilize the situation in Donbass by shelling settlements, and preparations are well underway to resolve the conflict by force. The People's Militia Command strongly urges its adversary to drop its criminal intent, said military deputy Eduard Basurin in a statement on Telegram, according to Russia's TASS news agency. The DPR, along with the Luhansk People's Republic, first declared their independence from Kiev back in 2014 after former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych was ousted in a U.S.-backed coup, sparking a war in the Donbass. The conflict has been a stalemate with occasional flare-ups. Amid heightened tensions between the U.S. and Russia, both sides have been accusing the other of planning an offensive in the Donbass. Basurin said the Ukrainian forces are sending UR-77 self-propelled minesweepers toward the conflict zone in the Donbass and are preparing military vehicles for combat. He also said DPR intelligence has informed that Ukraine is deploying an armored brigade to the region. At this point, it's not clear if Ukraine is planning an escalation in the Donbass, but if violence does flare up in the region, the U.S. is poised to blame it on Russia, no matter who the real aggressor is. Earlier this month, the White House claimed without any evidence that Russia is preparing a false flag operation in eastern Ukraine against the DPR and LPR separatists as a way to justify an invasion. Despite the constant U.S. claims, Russia clearly has no interest in invading Ukraine, but a flare-up in the Donbass could give the hawks in Washington the invasion that they are looking for, and it could be used to justify action against Russia, whether it be sanctions or more military developments in the region. So yeah, this gives you some background to these constant claims that Russia is preparing an invasion. We see that at least in December that the 10,000 Russian troops were pulled back from the Ukrainian border. Again, there could be any number of reasons why those troops were there in the first place. It could be that Putin has some kind of intelligence that Kiev is planning some kind of offensive in the Donbass. It could also be posturing to show Biden that, hey, you got to take this seriously. Like, our red lines, we've told you these red lines. We're poised to enforce these red lines, and we're putting soldiers there just to make sure that you respect them and that you know we're serious in negotiations. But again, like it just doesn't make sense strategically that the Russians would invade Ukraine. They haven't shown any interest strategically in invading Ukraine. So I just wanted to kind of go over that and substantiate what those arguments are. But after reading Dave DeCamp's articles, it just makes me concerned. You know, I've talked about cyber attacks this whole time and how that could kick things off. I want to put that puzzle piece in the grander picture. But I am concerned about this article I just read. It was posted today. I hadn't read it yet today, that it seems like Kiev might be preparing an offensive into the Donbass. But again, you know, you got to take it with a grain of salt. And again, here's another article from Dave DeCamp. Ukraine slams U.S. Embassy drawdown, says security situation hasn't changed. So we have in the last couple days here since Sunday, today is Monday, we have these hyperbolic reports, hyperbolic reaction. We have reports that the United States has pulled some of their diplomats from Ukraine. So the EU is not doing that. And it seems like the Ukraine is slamming that as being hyperbolic and hysterical. So the EU is not withdrawing diplomats' families from Ukraine. They say there's no reason to dramatize the situation. While the Biden administration and U.S. media outlets are constantly warning of an imminent Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Ukrainians don't seem as concerned. In a statement Monday, Ukraine's foreign ministry denounced the U.S. decision to evacuate some diplomats and their families from the embassy in Kiev, saying the decision was premature and a manifestation of excessive caution. The State Department announced the move on Sunday and has also issued a new travel advisory due to increased threats of Russian military action, but Ukraine's foreign ministry said the security situation hasn't changed. Quote, "In fact, there have been no radical changes in the security situation recently. The threat of new waves of Russian aggression has remained constant since 2014, and the accumulation of Russian troops near the state border began in April last year," which is true, the ministry said. Sorry, that's true. That's my editorialization, but it's true. A source close to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told BuzzFeed News that Zelensky, quote, "does not think there's any remotely imminent threat to Kiev at this time." The source said the Americans are, quote, "safer in Kiev than they are in Los Angeles or any other crime-ridden city in the U.S." In public comments last week, Zelensky said there was already a risk for war, and the only thing that has changed recently is the amount of attention on the situation. Quote, "These risks existed. They haven't become bigger. The excitement around them has grown," he said. Some of Washington's European allies are also not playing along with the U.S.'s scaremongering. Joseph Borrell, the EU's foreign policy chief, said the EU wouldn't withdraw the families of its diplomats from Ukraine because there's no need to dramatize the situation. "We are not going to do the same thing," he said, "because we don't know any specific reasons." Okay, so I think I've backed up that claim enough, relying heavily on Dave DeCamp there for a lot of the most recent reporting. But we get it from, the Ukrainian President Zelensky himself that there's no imminent threat to Kiev. And I think if there was, he would be the one ringing the alarm bells because the United States is his protector. So as we're closing up shop here again, I'm going to rely on Dave DeCamp and antiwar.com, but also Ray McGovern. But to trace through like the recent history of these claims of cyber attacks being pulled off by the Russians. So we have this op-ed from Consortium News, Ray McGovern and Joe Loria from December 21st, 2020, talking about this history of cyber attacks. I'm just trying to see which one is older. So here's an article by Dave DeCamp talking about senators liken hack to Russian invasion despite lack of proof that Moscow was involved. So media parroting claim that Russia was involved as fact. Joe Biden promises retaliation for cyber attacks. This is December 17th, 2020. Despite the lack of evidence that Russia was behind a massive hack that appears to have targeted several U.S. government agencies, U.S. senators are calling for retaliation against Moscow, even likening the cyber attack to an invasion. So you can see kind of the lineage of this idea of like a cyber 9/11, but also cyber attacks being grounds for war, an invasion, and specifically by Russia. Quote, "This is virtually a declaration of war by Russia on the United States, and we should take it seriously," Senator Dick Durbin said in an interview with CNN on Wednesday. On Thursday, Durbin called for a response against Moscow on the Senate floor, describing the hack as a virtual invasion. How unhinged is that? Quote, "No, I'm not calling for an invasion myself or all-out war. Then why put it in that terms, idiot? I don't want to see that happen, but it's no longer a buddy-buddy arrangement between the U.S. and Vladimir Putin. Oh boy," he said on Thursday. "When adversaries such as Russia torment us, tempt us, breach the security of our nation, we need to respond in kind." Senator Mitt Romney chimed in on Thursday and said in a statement on Twitter that there's been inexcusable silence and inaction from the White House over the hack. So I think this is referring to the SolarWinds hack. Yeah, it is. The hack of the software company SolarWinds was discovered by the cybersecurity firm FireEye. SolarWinds software is used by various U.S. government agencies and hundreds of corporations. When FireEye first reported the hack, the firm said it was carried out by a nation state, but did not specify which one. And so my understanding is that it turns out that it could have been pretty much anyone. And the password for the SolarWinds password was like SolarWinds123 or something like that. It was just ridiculous. So this was an event that happened, that we should remember that it happened. The next one here is Ray McGovern, a pandemic of Russian hacking. And yeah, again, here, January 6, 2021, sorry, jumping around, but another article from Dave DeCamp blaming Russia without evidence that they were behind the SolarWinds hack. So, a pandemic of Russian hacking by Ray McGovern. Neither the actor nor the motive nor the damage done is known for certain in this latest scare story. So, talking about hyperbolic, evidence-free media reports on the, quote, fresh outbreak of the Russian hacking disease seems an obvious attempt by intelligence to handcuff President-elect Joe Biden into a strong anti-Russian posture as he prepares to enter the White House. Biden might well need to be inoculated against the Russophobe fever. Ray McGovern is just a treasure to read. So, he says, new Cold Warriors are bent on preventing any such rapprochement with strong support from the intelligence community's mouthpiece media. U.S. hardliners are clearly still on the rise. So then again, McGovern kind of goes through, at the time, what was the evidence being presented and the hysteria behind the SolarWinds hack. However, he also traces what the lineage of this whole idea is. Talks about the Russian hacking, remember this from 2016 in the election, and that was why Donald Trump got elected. Okay, and earlier we were talking about Russia really seeming to try to assuage these fears that they would be behind some kind of hacking attack or cyber attack against the West. And that really, it continues on into the last couple weeks here. And on January 14th, of this year, Russia, here's an article from Reuters. Russia takes down Revil hacking group at U.S. request. And at U.S. request, I just want to underscore that. So the article says, Russia has dismantled ransomware crime group REVIL, Revil, maybe you pronounce that, or R-Evil, at the request of the United States in an operation in which it detained and charged the group's members, the FSB Domestic Intelligence Service said on Friday. The arrests were a rare apparent demonstration of U.S.-Russian collaboration at a time of high tensions between the two over Ukraine. The announcement came as Ukraine was responding to a massive cyber attack that shut down government websites, though there was no indication the incidents were related. So I did mention this in a Dave DeCamp article just a little earlier in the show here. The U.S. welcomed the arrests, according to a senior administration official, adding, quote, "We understand that one of the individuals who was arrested today was responsible for attack against Colonial Pipeline last spring." There's a typo there. A May cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline that led to widespread gas shortages on the U.S. East Coast used encryption software called DarkSide, which was developed by R-Evil Associates. A police and FSB operations searched 25 addresses detaining 14 people. The FSB said listing assets it had seized, including 426 million rubles, $600,000, 500,000 euros, computer equipment, and 20 luxury cars. So anyways, here's a demonstration here that Russia is very aware of the fact that the U.S., it seems like, is trying to set it up or paint this narrative that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. So immediately they cooperate with the United States, showing that they don't have, they're not suspicious here. They don't have ulterior motives. They're going to cooperate and take down this R-Evil hacking group. And I think that's very noteworthy. And then just to go into some very recent news, this came out today, January 24th, 2022. Hacktivists, so of course, I'm I'm trying to demonstrate that the risk of some kind of a cyber false flag or some kind of situation is very, very high. Hacktivists claim ransomware strike on Belarus railway intended to disrupt Russian forces. It's kind of chaotic here. As the political crisis in Ukraine deepens, warfare is evolving with the times. So, it even could be a situation where there's a cyber hacktivists who don't even belong to any kind of, they're not state sponsored at all, want to get involved, and maybe they have political feelings one way or the other. They want to set up Russia, or they want conflict between Russia and the West, and they just come in to cause chaos. This says, in an apparent bid to stop a Russian arms buildup near the Ukrainian border, a, quote, pro-democracy hacktivist group claims to have hacked the Belarusian highway system, allegedly one of the conduits for tanks and weaponry into the region. The incident comes as Russian and NATO allied forces continue to spar over the political future of Ukraine, heightening the risk of war. Belarus, which sits to the north of Ukraine, is considered a key Kremlin ally in the ongoing conflict and has seen an accumulation of Russian soldiers and weaponry as the two nations prepare for upcoming joint military exercises. U.S. commentators have accused Russia of using Belarus in the exercises as an excuse to encircle Ukraine militarily. In a post to its Telegram page on Monday, the hacktivist group known as Cyber Partisans claimed to have struck the nation's railway system, apparently spiking it with ransomware as a way to deter further transfers of arms. The hackers also published images of what they said were files compromised in the attack and demanded the release of numerous, quote, political prisoners, which they said had been illegitimately incarcerated by the government. So there's some more information here, but it's just the rush here. There's the buildup of 100,000 Russian troops at Ukraine's borders, heightened tensions, and led American officials to accuse Putin of wanting to invade the neighboring country. Again, the United States, has been doing that for a long time, and Zelensky says that he's not currently worried about any kind of threat to Kiev in the past couple weeks. So, yeah, just wanted to document those events and show exactly what this looks like going forward. So, going forward here, I just wanted to do this episode again to kind of talk about this idea of a cyber 9/11, and I think something that's probably coming, and we all know it's something that we have to defend against, which is this idea of a license to use the internet, or like biometric tracing for internet use. In the future, I mean, think about like a totalitarian's wet dream, is that we're able to, in some ways, if the NSA or the alphabet soup agencies really want to know what you're doing on the internet, they have ways to find out. But wouldn't it be much easier in kind of like, in a complete panopticon surveillance society if you had to biometrically prove your identification before you went on the internet or something like that? I mean, that way they could track and trace everything very easily. But, and then again, just to warn about, a false flag or some kind of thing leading up to war that the evidence really doesn't support. If you really look into what people are saying and the details, look behind the hype of the mainstream media, look behind the hysteria of the U.S. State Department, and realize the truth about what's been happening, the truth about what has happened in Ukraine since 2014, even before that, but especially since 2014. And just to be wary, and that doesn't mean we have to, trust trust Vladimir Putin or trust other countries or think that they're telling the truth all the time, but just kind of take a sober look at the evidence and really evaluate the risks of these things. But always to be vigilant of the threat, of the threat as it's perceived by the West. Be vigilant of those narratives, of the threat of some kind of a Russian invasion. Think about the motives, think about what they've been saying, but also to be vigilant in our own right and suspicious of any kind of attack, any cyber attack. Put your false flag goggles on just to see information as it comes in, to evaluate that information, and to be skeptical of its source before we go throwing our ideas behind hysteria. Like Tim Pool and Luke Rudkowski talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and how China is going to invade Taiwan. So that's a nice segue into next week's episode that I'm planning with Connor Freeman and Kyle Anzalone. So be sure to check out the show notes page. Again, this is episode 200 of the podcast, and I didn't plan any special event or anything, but the show notes is at libertyweekly.net/200, where you can do all of your reading of Dave DeCamp, the stuff that you should be doing anyways, keeping up with antiwar.com. There's a lot of people I've seen in the last little bit here saying, well, how can I, this has been thrust into the forefront of my mind. How do I get this information? How do I know what's going on? Who to trust? Well, you could watch this episode, but you could also just go to antiwar.com and you could read Dave DeCamp every day, and you can see the fine work that Kyle Anzalone is doing there. And, a bunch of other people. It's not just Dave and Kyle who run antiwar.com. Eric Garris being another major figure over there, of course, been doing it longer than Kyle and Dave have. So, all right. So hats off to antiwar.com. Make sure that you're reading it so you understand what's going on. And we will catch you next week, where we will be dissecting Tim Pool and Luke Rudkowski and their war fear mongering. So look forward to that. All right. Thanks everyone. Peace out.